In particular, it increases the size of the population. It eventually ages the population, so the population becomes more adult in simple demographic terms. And above all, it concentrates the population in urban areas. And in those circumstances, I believe, political power eventually becomes more diffused in society. Moreover, the resulting increase in population size means that representative democracy with political parties tends to supplant the ideal of direct participatory democracy. Now, this is a bit of me. Not everyone would necessarily agree with it, and of course it's an extremely difficult thing to prove. I don't believe I've proved it, but nevertheless, what this diagram does show is a broad correspondence for all world regions for where we can get some sort of data between the level of urbanization and the trend in urbanization and a measure of democracy based on the Polity3 database. I am not suggesting that changes in democratization are only brought about by demographic factors, and indeed in certain circumstances, for example, this long period of plateauing in these measures of democracy for Europe, and also a similar, different period of plateauing here in Latin America, which I think both of which can be explained in terms of other factors. But I think that that is an argument that's worth considering. Well, finally, there are strong reasons to believe that the processes of the demographic transition have underlain much of the reduction in gender differentiation that has taken place in society. And if there was one reading I would refer you to here, it would be that by Kingsley Davis and Pietronella Vandenova, which is on this sheet. Consider, for example, that in a pre-transitional society, as many as 3/4 of all women aged 15 to 49 are likely to be either pregnant or lactating at any one time. However, as the demographic transition proceeds, so childbearing comes to constitute a much smaller fraction of women's much longer lives. You've got an increase in life expectancy, and you've got a reduction in fertility. Consequently, the livelihoods of women gradually become less tied to concerns of the domestic domain. And interestingly in this context, I think there are reasons to think that the consequent reduction in gender differentiation has been asymmetrical. By that I mean, and I'm talking really about European societies and similar societies, by that I mean that it is women's lives that have become more like those led by men rather than the reverse, although I would like to see some change in the opposite direction as well, although that takes us into the future. Well, so far I've addressed the positive sides, or some of the positive sides of the demographic transition, but the transition also has its problematic side. For example, the rapid population growth rates and high population growth multiples that have characterized recent transitions in some developing countries have raised significant developmental challenges. This side of the unprecedented population growth that has come out of the demographic transition, I will illustrate briefly in 3 ways. So it's got its good side, many good sides, but it's got its problems as well. Most things tend to have advantages and disadvantages, if you like. So, here we go, Gordana. Yeah. The first topic I will refer to in this context is that after a long period of agnosticism on the subject, the weight of current thinking among economists who study the issue is expressed well in this statement by Nancy Birdsall and Steve Sinding. And I notice you're getting Steve later in this lecture series. They say, and this is based upon a collection of studies that were presented at a meeting in Bellagio 6 or 7 years ago. They say that, and this is, as it were, the current state of thinking amongst economists who look at this issue. Rapid population growth is found to have exercised a quantitatively important negative impact on the pace of aggregate economic growth in developing countries. I'll read it again. Rapid population growth is found to have exercised a quantitatively important negative impact on the pace of aggregate economic growth in developing countries. And they go on, rapid fertility decline, the adoption of birth control and the reduction in fertility, rapid fertility decline is found to make a quantitatively relevant contribution to reducing the incidence and severity of poverty. There's a lot of work which shows that children in larger families tend to be disadvantaged in terms of food, education, nutritional status, etc., relative to children in smaller families, holding other factors constant in as much as it can be done. Okay, go down to the next one. Here's a simple, quick illustration of that. It's the cross-sectional international relationship between per capita income growth on the horizontal axis, on the vertical axis, and population growth on the horizontal axis. And particularly if these data relate to long periods of time. Economists spend a lot of time dealing with 10-year periods. But you've got to look at long periods of time if you want to look at fundamental relationships. And particularly if you look at this, this actually relates to 1950 to 2000, I think. But particularly if you look at the period since the first oil shock, 1975 up until the present day, it's a really strong relationship. So that's one thing. If one really wants to make poverty history, then I think that family planning, promoting family planning, is one of the ways. It's one of the tools in the kit box. Okay, now, second, go down the next one. Yeah. The second, many countries in the world today are concerned about how rapidly their urban populations are growing because they have to provide urban infrastructure, sewage, roads, electricity, housing, etc., etc., etc. So rapid urban population growth is seen by many developing governments as being a major challenge, rightly, given how fast urban growth can be. But as Sam Preston has observed, oddly in this context, family planning services are rarely seen as a candidate for slowing urban growth. There are only basically two reasons why urban populations grow. They increase either through urban natural increase or through rural to urban migration. And of course, usually it's a mixture of the two. But both of those proximate factors behind urban growth are strongly conditioned by the overall rate of population growth. And you can see this in a very simple plot, which Gordana is showing us now. It's a very strong relationship. So, again, family planning is relevant in this context, I believe. And finally, Gordana, population growth exerts an upward effect on CO2 emissions, other things equal. Now, when we switch to CO2 emissions, you see the importance of context. Population growth always has to be seen in context. Because this particular effect is much bigger in rich countries because of their much higher levels of per capita emissions. And I can show this with a very